We're now going to move on to our first panel discussion, looking at inclusive education in the context of disruption. So if I could invite the panel to come up and take their seats here, and I'll hand you over to Andrew Jack to chair this and to introduce the rest of the panel. Andrew is the Global Education Editor at the Financial Times. And Andrew, thank you for looking after this session.
Thanks very much, Julian. Do please sit down. Thank you, Julia, and above all to Lucy and Angela, congratulations for your very well-deserved prize. Just a couple of words of introduction, incidentally. You might not think of the Financial Times as being focused on education and equity, but actually it's very important to me and indeed to many of my colleagues. And indeed, CAMFED was one of the first seasonal charities supported by the FT, and I think one of our most successful ones. And indeed, we've recently refocused and created a standalone charity which is focused on financial literacy and inclusion, really focusing on underrepresented groups and that important issue to try to include more from around the world amongst people who aren't so engaged or understanding of finance and money. Beyond that, I should say we've been very involved with Room to Read. In my own humble capacity, I help organise our programme offering free access to the FT for school children around the world. And indeed, next week you'll see the culmination of a big series we've been running called Investing in Education, and that's public investment, incidentally, in education. So I think a really important moment, and we're now going to move, as Julian said, into our first panel discussion, which is talking about inclusive education in the context of disruption. And I think sort of following on from Julia's remark about the importance of country-led interventions, we should perhaps start on the ground with Fiona Mavenga, who's an executive advisor to CAMFED, and hear a little bit about, first of all, I'll ask all of our panelists to talk to us a little bit just about what they're seeing currently in terms of the damage, the challenges, the sort of state of play in this period of disruption, and notably, obviously, of course, as we hopefully start to emerge from COVID. So Fiona, give us your perspective from Zimbabwe and beyond about what you're observing in terms of where we've got to, what the setbacks are, what the challenges are that we're currently facing.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I also wanted to say that I was supported by CAMFED to realize my dreams of becoming an educated woman. So it's a privilege to be sitting here. And together with women who completed school with CAMFED support, we are members of the CAMFED Alumni Network, the CAMFED Association, 178,000 of us. And we are multiplying the investment in education, in our education that CAMFED did by reaching out to more children, supporting both girls and boys to also go to school. In terms of the question that Andrew asked, I wanted to also say that, you know, a majority of the children that we work with are orphans, double orphans. And these are children that are sometimes growing up in child-headed households or under the care of elderly grandparents, like Rufaro that Angie described earlier on. And for some that might be fortunate to have both parents, their parents have not been through education themselves. So when COVID arrived in our communities and demanded that public spaces shut to the extent of shutting down schools, for the children in the circumstances that I just described, it also meant that learning stopped. They could not pivot to alternative learning methods because they didn't have access to remote learning facilities. Angie described the fact that for most children, they didn't have access to ICT gadgets. These are in households that are not connected to the electrical grid. The digital divide that already existed before the pandemic was amplified, especially for these children. And we did a study in Tanzania among the children that are supported through school by CAMFED to find out how they are coping and continuing to learn. And what we found was that only 34% of the students that we worked with were living in households that were connected to electricity. 21% had a TV in their house. Our and 38% a radio. Only 24% had at least one family member with a smartphone. And for those that had TV or radio, sometimes it's just an asset on the shelf because it doesn't have battery or it's not connected to electricity. And in Zimbabwe, the UN has just released a report that showed that only 25% of children continued to learn in 2020, compared to 70% of urban children due to difficulties in accessing ICT facilities. There were no government support packages, and most families faced increasing poverty. They lacked food, and they turned to survival practices that in most cases meant children or young people had to work to supplement family income. And also think about this, that in our communities, schools are not just hubs of learning. They are also centers of accessing support. And I was reflecting and thinking that in our communities, especially where I grew up in Zimbabwe, our postal address is our school address. So your letters might be addressed to you, but it comes through your primary school or your secondary school, and it's announced at assembly that there's a letter for this family. And if you don't have children in school, it's collected by neighbors to get to you. So when schools closed, it meant isolation from social support, as the mentoring, the school meals that are provided through school were also cut. And if I'm thinking about the situation of girls, you know, Julia Lucy described that, you know, the barriers that girls face for completing their education are rooted in poverty and gender inequity. And both these were magnified or amplified during the pandemic. Most girls had to take on additional caring duties. They had to work for money, for food. Our CAMFED Association members who are on the ground reported how many girls were going to drop out of school to get married as a way of accessing food and security. Rose, our CAMFED Association member in Malawi, shared how girls were being told that it's the end of the world. They will never experience motherhood unless they get married now. CAMFED Association member TCNG in Zambia reported the myths that started in communities about the virus because people lacked access to trusted information. So this has been the situation in our communities, and the challenges for young people were certainly exacerbated. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Fiona. A very powerful reminder of the kind of the resonance beyond the school, of course, and the children themselves to the wider communities. So, Pauline, obviously you're doing great work at the Real Centre, and you've got a sort of global perspective. So put that into context for us in terms of what you're seeing in multiple countries where you're working.
Thanks, Andrew. And just while I'm holding the mic, I'm going to take the opportunity to also congratulate Angie and Lucy and the whole of the CAMFED community. CAMFED is all about community, both on the ground as well as within CAMFED itself. And I know that we've got a number of colleagues here. It's been a wonderful journey for us in the Real Centre because we started our journey with our launch with CAMFED, with Julia and Boris and Fiona. We were on a panel together then, so it's lovely to be back together. And I feel that we're part of the CAMFED community too. Hopefully you'll see us as together with you. And I think all we've heard so far just identifies why you've won the prize. I don't think it goes without saying almost, but I think it's just so heartfelt. But I'm so struck, Fiona, how you've both got the sort of depth of knowledge on the ground, but also the facts and figures. So I'm a self-declared data nerd, and Julia and I have had many conversations about this. So maybe just to start with one of those global figures, and going back, Julia, to what you were saying about how we need a global metric. So the World Bank's figure in relation to the numbers of children not being able to read a very basic text by the age of 10. If you just think at age 10, you know, you should have spent several years in school, you should be able to read a basic text. They've said that 72 million more children are not going to be able to read a basic text as a result of COVID. This is many children who are going back in their learning. So even if they could read a basic text, that's been wiped out as a result of school closures and other things going on. And that represents around 2/3 of children from poor families in low and low middle income countries. 2 in every 3 child is not able to read a basic text. So I think that really brings it home to us about why programmes like CAMFED are so important in supporting the most marginalised girls. A lot of our work has been in Ethiopia over this context of COVID, and I think there's a couple of things I wanted to just sort of highlight, maybe in a positive, but in a very challenging and depressing context. One is how nimble a number of funders have been in supporting the likes of us in adapting to trying to identify evidence in this era of COVID, so that we could identify some of the sorts of things that Fiona was talking about in terms of what access there was to children to continue their learning, what access there is to technology, just very basic things like populations in rural communities not having a radio, so what point is it in providing education programs through radio? So in our work in Ethiopia, funded by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, as well as through the Girls' Education Challenge, we were able to quite nimbly adapt. We also got additional funding from the Lego Foundation, which enabled us to look at wider learning, but beyond just academic learning. And I think these things are really important, because if we hadn't been able to do that, we would still be debating in 10 years' time what we should be debating now. And what struck me is what we, I think, as researchers have also achieved, and I hope the likes of Alicia and others will agree, is that we've been providing evidence on time in a timely manner. And that is really something that we often would have been criticised for, quite rightly, and has been changing. So I think there's a lot of positive learnings, while we're coming out with quite depressing figures on what's actually happening on the ground. So looking at our work in Ethiopia and sort of also relating that to other studies that are now beginning to emerge on this question of learning loss, inevitably we are seeing that children are regressing in their learning. And it's perhaps inevitable, but it's sad that it is so inevitable, that it is the most disadvantaged populations. So we see time and time again, it's those living in rural areas, it's those from poorer households, those that have parents who themselves aren't literate and haven't been able to support their children at home, who have been suffering from what we're calling learning loss. And there's evidence from our work in Ethiopia, there's emerging evidence from other colleagues in other organisations in Ghana and Pakistan and elsewhere. And I think it's just really needs to be a wake-up call that we can't wait another generation till we start to tackle some of these issues. One thing that I find quite striking is across all of these data that we're beginning to see is that the effect of learning loss has been similar for girls and boys. And this is despite the fact that there's a lot of evidence also that shows that girls' domestic burdens, particularly as they're sort of older, have increased, that girls have increasingly had to get married early and or having children at an early age during this period of disruption. So it's sort of quite a conundrum as to why we're seeing that. Of course, sometimes it's because we need to sort of break down the data further and look really what's happening at those most marginalised girls. But what we do see, which is of a cause for concern, is when we broaden learning beyond the academic learning to also consider socio-emotional learning and mental health issues, it is girls that are coming out as being most affected by a sort of backward process in relation to those. So I think we need to make sure that we're not just focusing on just the numbers of those that are learning, striking and important as they are, but also what else it is that we're expecting from education systems. I'll just pick up on two other things very briefly. One thing that's also struck me from the sort of evidence that's coming out is that dropout from school hasn't necessarily immediately been as huge as we might have anticipated. So in our work in Ethiopia, we've sort of identified that about 15% of the children who were sort of grade 4 level haven't gone back to school. Now, that's obviously a large number and we need to be concerned about it, but it is an issue, that's an issue on an ongoing basis, not just in relation to COVID. Again, the issue is higher for girls as they get older in particular, due to their domestic burdens and also issues of early marriage which have come to the fore. So we definitely need to keep monitoring, and we need to check whether they are staying in school or whether they just enrolled, and so just a very initial blip. And the last point I just want to make is around coming back to the question on teachers. I think we really need to fundamentally be thinking of teachers at the heart of any discussion on education, and female teachers in particular. So from some of the work we've been doing with the Girls' Education Challenge independent evaluation, we've done a study on teachers and teaching, which is hopefully coming out soon. And that has shown how female teachers in general, but female teachers in particular, during school closures were having to do far more than try to support children's learning. They were providing social welfare support in the communities, and that task did fall often on the female teachers, who themselves also had often increased burdens at home. So I think sort of thinking about as schools have reopened, these challenges and burdens aren't going away, and we need to give teachers far more support and respect, quite frankly, than they often get.
Thanks, Bob. And I presume even if the learning loss might be relatively equal between boys and girls, presumably the absolute loss for girls may be greater, both with a higher dropout rate and a lower level of inclusion in the first place, presumably.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, and a reminder to all of you also watching online, do please use the facility to ask questions, and I'll try to get through some of them over the next half an hour or so, as well as calling, of course, on our great in-person three-dimensional audience here. But Alicia, and we're going to switch in a minute to next steps, what the future could look like, what more needs to be done. But just initially, please, your, as it were, stock take on what, from a donor perspective and seeing also and following trends in global education systems, what's your take currently on where we are in terms of the issue of equity post-COVID?
Yeah, and thank you very much for that, Andrew. So, we've heard really powerful testimony already from Fiona, and what's happening on the ground, and real numbers and real lives, and what the impact of the pandemic, and indeed as well from Pauline on the sort of some of the global numbers, and we always recoil when we hear those numbers. So COVID and its economic and financial and social impact has sort of dominated our lives over the course of the past 18 months or so. We had reference this morning already to the climate crisis on COP26 in Glasgow in 4 weeks' time, and the IPCC report that we've had recently, which was termed the sort of code red for humanity. But over the course of the past 18 months as well, I think we've had another major disruption, and that's around the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think what that has done is, for all of us, whoever we are, wherever we are, is to start thinking about how we relate to other people, that interpersonal relationship. How do we relate to each other within organizations, across societies, and indeed globally? And I think what it has done as well is brought to the fore a simmering discussion within the aid community and the power dynamics of aid and the power dynamics of development. And Julia already touched on that this morning, talking about, in spite of all of the progress that we've made, for example, within the GPE, and the voices of developing country partners in that forum and in that partnership, that we still have some way to go. There's still some that she said, and I quote you here, Julia, about the white savior complex being very much alive. So I just want to add that to the mix. We've got COVID and the impact, we've got climate, and we're thinking about that. But I also want to add that other dimension. And indeed, that disruption continues. We know that, for example, if we look at what's happening with respect to COVID, still about at least 14 countries around the world, 1/4, where schools remain closed. That's about 77 million children and young people who have not set foot in a classroom in the past 18 months. And indeed, we know there's a big global campaign led by UNICEF now in order to get schools reopening safely. And the UK government is very much in support of that. We know that the pandemic, we know that what's happening with respect to climate, we know when we reflect around issues on Black Lives Matter and power relationships, that in fact, over the course of the past 18 months, all of those inequalities, all of those differences have really come to the fore. They've been exposed, they've been exacerbated, and I think we can't afford to avert our gaze anymore. We are grappling with the learning losses, which have been compounded. I think let's not kid ourselves in this room that we didn't have learning losses before. We did. The figures are there, the numbers are there, the data is there. Certainly been compounded over the course of the past 18 months. We're reflecting on what it means for future productivity, We're reflecting on what it means for marginalised groups, particularly girls. You know, there's a big focus within the British government on girls' education, what it means for issues like early marriage and pregnancy and abuse as well. So, you know, for us, it's about redoubling those efforts. We've always been very focused on supporting inclusive education systems. So how do you make those systems more inclusive? I think we're doubling down on that, as well as looking at particular support for groups. You know, Pauline mentioned girls, marginalised girls in particular. We've got refugee communities, children living with disabilities, for example. So that's been our approach. And I think what it does for us now is say that we must redouble efforts and have that focus moving forward. Thank you.
So let's now switch a bit to going forwards, and perhaps it's picking up on the question earlier about, you know, if we had more money, but of course it's not just money, it's also mobilisation, support, resources, coordination. There are many different things. But, you know, what would each of you consider, you know, what the key next step should be? What should be the priorities to tackle both kind of the learning loss that we've heard about in recent months, but also really focus on driving much greater equity and improved educational outcomes for all going forwards? Pauline, do you want to start?
Sure. I think this is a really important question, and I think some of the things that we're sort of learning or coming out with in relation to COVID are things that we should have been doing before, and is putting even more pressure on us doing them now. So one of them, which very much relates to the learning loss, is about curriculum reform. So, you know, we've got time and time again evidence that shows us that the pace of the curriculum is not at the pace of many of the children who are sitting in the classroom, that those who are weaker learners, whether it's because, for the reasons we've been saying, they don't have the sort of parents who have been educated and able to support them at home, because they're from poorer families, because they've got domestic burdens at home, because they're children with disabilities, etc., that they are potentially not the focus of the curriculum, and they're sitting in the classroom with what they're being taught up here, and they're still at the very basic starting point of whether they can read, do a very basic sum. So the number one, I would say, fundamental issue is to really address this curriculum reform. I've always got a question in my head as to why it doesn't happen, because it's such an obvious thing. You know, you'd think that any government would want their children to learn these basics, so why is it that curriculum reform isn't happening? Many of the systems, I guess, and going back to Ethiopia, where we've been doing a lot of work, have moved from being an elite system to a mass system within quite a short period of time, within 20 years or so. So maybe it's a sort of partly a question of time, but is it because education systems are still run by the elites and they're not yet at a stage where they're reforming? I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts on that. But I do think we've also got to tackle other forms of disadvantage from those very early years as well. You know, there's really strong evidence that early childhood education and in preschool years and in the very early years of primary school is where disadvantage starts. And if you don't tackle it then children from the poorest households, as girls in particular, will already be either dropping out of school or in school and not learning. So we really need to sort of identify within particular contexts what it is that is holding those most disadvantaged children back and tackle those issues. There's another couple of basic things. I mean, it's just really striking how now that's one of the things that we've been brought to the fore is how many schools and classes do not have basic sanitation. Such an obvious thing. It should have been an investment many, many years ago, and now we're all shocked that children are having to go back to school without having hand wash facilities. This should just be, you know, it should go without saying. And just, I've got lots of other points, but I'll just make one last point, which is about the making sure that barriers to girls who are pregnant and have children are taken down so that they can return to school, whether that's legal barriers, which still exist in some countries, but also other barriers which might be to do with childcare support and other things. We know that there are going to be now many more girls, adolescent girls, who are going to be with children, and we need to make sure that they aren't held back in terms of their education. So I'll stop there for now and love to hear from others.
Thanks. I'm sure we're going to have some time in questions. So, but Fiona, a couple of thoughts from you, the key things that people should be focusing on going forwards.
Thank you, Andrew. I think the way local communities responded to the crisis, gives us a blueprint of how we must engage going forward if we are thinking about building back better. Our communities were very agile and responsive in finding ways to support children that were out of school, identifying the resources and support that they needed to be able to continue learning and to safeguard children. I think we must give credit that we are achieving school return rates of over 95%, and as Pauline mentioned, that the dropout rate from school has not been as high as expected, and I think that's great credit to the way our community is supported. At CAMFED, we had over 4,000 young women who were on the ground as active learner guides in our remote rural schools. They spoke to local leaders, they spoke to chiefs, magistrates, and parents to keep girls learning and to keep them out of marriage. I recall a CAMFED Association member called Faith in Zimbabwe who took immediate action to prevent a girl who was going to marry a shopkeeper and walked a long distance because there was no public transport during the lockdown. And she said that I could not wait any longer because if I wait, it might be too late and this girl would enter into this marriage, and that she was afraid to wait until COVID scare had stopped because she might have eloped anyway. And she went to explain to her the importance of staying at home, staying in education, and to motivate her and give her hope that schools will eventually reopen and that she can be able to realize her dreams as an educated young woman. In Zambia, our network of CAMFED learner guides were on the radio, they were on WhatsApp, partnering with local officials to deliver correct health information and to also deliver learning content and even convening socially distanced study groups, providing printed learning material to children that had not access to ICT facilities, and to ensure that they continued learning. You know, we had young women who had businesses in stationery, like Eva in Tanzania, who was photocopying learning materials and distributing them for free to learners in her community. So I think that, you know, what we need to do is to empower local communities, and especially those that have lived experience of disadvantage, to be at the forefront of designing solutions. And to Pauline's earlier point, we need to apply a gender and equity lens to all the solutions that we come up with so that we really break down the barriers to quality education. Let's also prioritize investment in programs that lift up the most marginalized. I think that's what I need to say.
Okay, thanks. And Alicia, I mean, obviously you're not a government minister, but we know, of course, FCDO has, I have to say it, has substantially cut the age budget, and they are focusing on, of course, girls' education, but one might argue beyond the GP contribution net, there's lower funding for girls' education across all of British aid programmes. So you're not in quite the same position of what would you do with $1 billion more, but perhaps with a certain amount less and how to reprioritise it. So what would your priorities be around that?
Yes, and absolutely. So I would not be responding to the question about 0.7 or 0.5. No, absolutely. So look, I think that, you know, for us, it's about, you know, and Pauline mentioned this, about the real focus on foundational learning. I think if we come back to this whole issue of exclusion and inequality and issues of equity, we know it starts from very, very early. So for us, it's that continued focus on foundational learning is quite key for us. The whole piece on evidence, you know, hugely important. You know, evidence-based approaches to diagnose, to test, learn, and adapt, and what works at scale, and to make decisions on the basis of that evidence of what works at scale, and continue to invest in that evidence. Because we know that, you know, on the back of COVID, for example, not only our budgets are constrained, but indeed in many of our partner countries as well. So how do we get the best value for money, you know, based on evidence, you know, evidence-rich interventions that can be used. And I think it's in that vein, for example, that we recently launched the What Works Hub. And the What Works Hub is intended to help strengthen the use of evidence at every stage of the implementation process. So those are the sorts of those are the sorts of interventions. That's our thinking across within the FCDO. I think on the back of that as well, Andrew, just another half a minute or so to say that in support of those evidence-based approaches, I think we need innovative financing as well. Julie already mentioned, for example, the Education Outcome Fund, which we are very proud and pleased to support, and indeed there are others around. But I think, and I always say to colleagues, the day of kind of putting £1 or $1 in and getting another dollar out, I think are long gone. I think we just, given the scale and the depth of the challenge that we've got, we have to find more innovative ways of financing education. We've got to be able to crowd in more actors into the education space. I know sometimes that's highly controversial, but I firmly believe that we need to do that. And indeed, some of us have been working in order to look at some of those innovative financing mechanisms, moving forward. So watch this space on that. Thank you.
Just a final thing, because I know, and we've heard earlier about COP, but around climate change, I think that's an area of focus for you, isn't it? What are you hoping to do there?
Yes, so I think definitely around COP, what we're looking to do is we will have a few events on the Gender Day and indeed on the Youth Day on girls' education and climate. We recognise, of course, that this is an area that's been shaped and being developed. We, the British government, or indeed anyone, we know that we don't have the answers on this. It's a sector within the education sector. We still need a fair amount of research, generation of evidence about how we move forward on it. But there are areas where we think we can apply what we already know in response to this particular challenge, but are very much in the space of listening and learning, and indeed following the leadership of those who are already in this space and making progress in that area. So in 4 weeks' time, at COP, and you can tell I know it's 4 weeks' time because the entire organisation is pivoted to the delivery of COP. In 4 weeks' time, in Glasgow, we will be putting on events on that and spotlighting this particular issue as the start of a journey on this. Certainly not the end of it. Thanks.
I'm going to open it up now to questions, just one second, but in a second. But I just wanted to, perhaps Pauline, very briefly, because obviously there are some people who would say, obviously girls are a huge priority, but there is a risk of a slight misplacing around that. If you look at this country, white working class boys, as we know, are those who are most underperforming. There is an argument, I've heard, that, for example, an ultra focus on, girls-related education can come at a sort of trade-off. For example, conditional cash transfers to girls for adolescents might actually deliver a less good what works best by than, a kind of holistic approach at pre-years, for example. Any thoughts on that nuance on the gender aspect?
Yeah, I think it's sort of something that those of us that work on gender issues often get asked. And I think it comes down to, in a jargonistic way, the difference between gender parity and gender equality. So gender parity being about equal numbers. And yes, we can sometimes see equal numbers, or even that there might be more girls in school in some contexts, for example. But the power dynamics, the discrimination they face, what happens to them after they leave school is very different. And I think we've really got to understand not only whether the numbers add up, but also the experiences that girls face and some of these more intangible things that we've been talking about and that colleagues in CAMFED work very directly with on the ground. I think it's really important that we go beyond just the numbers and understand. And that goes back to one of my points earlier about, the impact on mental health and socio-emotional aspects have hit girls far harder, but those are often far more difficult to measure in the ways that we might want some of these global figures to give us a big picture. Having said that, even with the parity issues, as we've been saying, it is often girls, particularly as they get older, who are starting to drop out earlier, who miss out on the sort of full experience of education. So I think it's really sort of thinking about those power dynamics and so on.
Okay, thanks. So we've only got about 10 minutes, otherwise Julian will probably rip us off stage to deprive you of your coffee. So please keep your questions brief. But Abel, you had your hand so up enthusiastically. Do briefly pose a question, please.
Okay, very brief. I wanted to ask one backwards and one forward, but very brief. So the backward one, is there any evidence that supports that school closure were right, especially in Africa? I'm from Tunisia. I think about Zimbabwe, such a young population. The learning loss is massive. massive. Is this like a white thing, like we've copied, kind of policies from richer countries with completely different demographics and kind of shot ourselves in the foot massively? So I would be curious, is there data? We don't have the counterfactual maybe, but would be curious. And the forward-looking one, very short also, is we are all aware here in this room about the global learning crisis. I feel still it's a silent pandemic. I've been engaged over the last month on the climate and education front. And when NDCs, none of them has almost education in it. It's what should we do differently to bring education more to the global agenda in such massive way as, for example, climate is?
Okay, who wants to do the backwards looking one first? Was it the right decision? Fiona?
I think the pandemic required that public spaces close, and to be able to curb infections, it might have been the right thing to do, but there was no enough preparation to what happens to children after schools have closed. How do you enable them to continue learning? Do they have the facilities that will enable learning to continue? I think of Zimbabwe. Last year, they lost 7 months of learning. They were only in school for about 90 days. There was no follow-on support to families, and especially those families that are in rural communities. So closing schools might have been the right thing to do, but they needed to have been immediate follow-on support to be able to support children so that they can continue learning, given what the countries know about the circumstances or the context of those children in the homes that they were going to, and the support that was being cut from them by closing down schools.
Okay, let's go Pauline or Alicia on the forward-looking. Yeah, you go ahead.
I'll go forward-looking. Yeah. So I think one of the things that sort of really strikes me in terms of the global agenda and being on the global stage relates to something that Julia was also saying earlier, is in my previous life, I was in UNESCO directing the Education for All Global Monitoring Report, so sort of seeing some of this play out, how much internal squabbling there is amongst those who work on global education in a way that is self-destructive. So you have UNESCO, UNICEF, World Bank, sometimes maybe even GPE, trying to squabble for having the centre stage, and actually that's not helpful. And that comes back to the point about us needing, this global figure, and not just a global figure, but also a global, us all standing together. And one of the things that, again, has struck me in this context of COVID is that there has been more coming together. So I was just looking at a report that the World Bank, UN agencies, GP might have been involved as well, OECD have produced, which has been monitoring what's happening in countries in terms of things like, in terms of curriculum reform, in terms of whether or not they've had remedial catch-up classes, etc., and sort of trying to monitor. And to me, I don't know whether there was internal squabbling on that, but at least externally, there's something that is really giving us really strong messages of what's happening and what we need to do to fill some of those gaps. So I'm really hopeful that as a result of some of this disruption, that it might be bringing the minds together to say we need to act quickly and we need to act together.
Okay, not just about new resources. Dankert, I think you had a question. No? Do I see Dankert? No? Sorry, hi. Oh, there you are. Beg your pardon. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to the panel. I'm coming from the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway, and followed the SDG process for quite some time. But I think it's quite evident that we had the inequality crisis before the pandemic struck. But we are coming out with an even more inequality crisis, I think, after the pandemic. So it's a question not only on finding the kind of facts behind it, because I think we know quite a lot of the facts, at least at a global level. So we need to find how to, I usually say that we have been fighting an uphill battle from 2015 until 2019. Now we are fighting a wall, because the hill has become a wall, and we need to find the doors, how to open that wall. And I think that is the main challenge for all around this table, and I think also for the global community as well, to find the keys to open the doors to get into the future. And just
Very
one...
briefly, a question, really,
Yeah,
because otherwise we'll run out of time.
but I think, and this is the question for Pauline, because I think the question about curriculum reform is important, because I think we have learned from the COVID-19 at least three things. That one is the globalization and the global interlinkage. The second is that it is important to use education for resilience. And the third is that we need to have a more cross-disciplinary approach to education. And the question is that going to happen?
That's an easy question for
Yes, it has to.
Okay, forgive me, because what we maybe we'll integrate into some other questions. I think Dorothy Gordon had a question. Yeah, is Dorothy here? Sorry.
I think she's the one who couldn't make it.
Oh, okay, so you can't make it. Yeah, do you want to come in? Yeah. Do just introduce yourself as well.
My name is Chris Thomas. I'm with the Yidan Prize Foundation. My question is the whole panel. Part of the big challenge is that so many people take the world as normal, with all its inequalities, with all its poverty, with all its other problems. What's not normal about this world for you, and how do you go about shifting people's minds, and what would educating all of the girls in Africa do to change that normal?
And who's that to, Fiona? Or,
All of you. Fiona? It'd be a great start.
I think for me, what's not normal is that we have so much potential that is logged in women and girls in marginalized communities, potential that could really lead to progress in our communities, as the founder of Yidan spoke earlier on this morning, that we have this so much potential that is locked down just because these children are born in circumstances of poverty and they are not able to break out. This is a vicious cycle that we have where children are not educated, they go on and have families and they are not educated themselves. We need to break that cycle, and for me, education is that circuit breaker for virtuous cycle. Thank you.
We've only got very few minutes left. I'm going to just briefly, there's a couple of online questions. So it was one about the opportunities from COP, which Alicia's partly answered. There's a point about girls with disabilities facing even greater hurdles to education. So what is needed to ensure they're not permanently left behind? And one also on how has non-formal education in the communities been explored during the disruption? And if anyone wants to take either that, the disabilities or the community non-formal education issues. Alicia, do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I can try to respond to a few of the questions which have just come in. I think that you're asking about what's not normal. To me, what's not normal is the fact that when I sat, whenever this happens to me, it just brings it home again and again. In March, sitting in a slum community in Freetown, and a 12-year-old girl saying to me she has never been to school. That is wrong. And to me, that cannot be normal, and it should not be normal. And that's what I think propels people like me and others in this room in order to try to find some small way in order to make a contribution so that you have fewer and fewer girls, or no girls at all at some point, saying to you that they've never actually been to school for all kinds of reasons. So to me, that's not normal. But indeed, that's part of a sort of wider system of inequality. And usually, if you have to tackle inequality, someone has got to cede power somewhere. And that's usually very, very difficult and very tough to unlock. So I don't think we underestimate the challenge ahead of us, but we must have a go at that. In terms of girls living with disabilities, absolutely, that's very much a focus of, that we've got within the British government, within FCGO, recognizing, of course, that they're one of the groups. Even when you look at girls' education and look at girls who tend to be left behind, that girls living with disabilities tend to be even furthest behind. And we've got a particular focus on that as well. Thanks.
Okay. Did I say the other was? Let me say. Oh my goodness. Maybe just one. Maybe I'll take just two there and here very briefly, and perhaps turn to Pauline to wrap up. Yeah, please. Do introduce yourself as well.
Hi, thank you. My name is Priscilla. I'm a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Education. So my question goes to either Fiona or Alicia. And I wanted to ask how exactly your organizations are working with the governments in these countries where the marginalized children live to ensure that the governments are not taking a backseat whilst your organizations are probably performing a function which should be the function of the government, and most probably usurping the role of the government while the government takes a backseat. So are there any accountability mechanisms, any mechanisms for collaboration between your organizations and governments to ensure wider reach?
Who wants to take that? Fiona, yeah.
Sure, I'll do that. Thank you very much. I think our work really ensures that we demand accountability from governments. The accountability sits with local, district, and national authorities. And in our work, we convene committees of every duty bearer in the community, be it traditional leaders, education authority, the police, social welfare. We bring them on the table to be able to inform where our support should go, and they also take any of evidences that of our work into their own budgets, into their own strategies. So we ensure that we bring them into the table, into the decision making for identifying the children that we support, ensuring that the wraparound support that is needed for them is available. So if it's child protection that is needed, if it's additional social welfare support that is needed, we bring every government duty bearer on the table to ensure that accountability sits with them. CAMFED is just coming in to facilitate their work and to enable them to reach the most marginalized, and by organizing communities and parents and everyone to ensure that, you know, they bring their voices and their views to these duty bearers that we bring together. Thank you.
I can't. I'm sorry. I can't deny the former Vice Chancellor, the man with the only man with the power to keep the coffee break open for us a little bit longer. If you want a very brief.
Very brief indeed. We've talked about disruption and COVID. I'm in infectious diseases. COVID will come and go. It's like every pandemic, it will recover. Its importance is resilience. Question for me is what happens in civil disturbance and natural disasters that occur. Educational systems in poor countries are not resilient. And the hidden loss, particularly where you focus on health and you focus on communication systems, education comes a poor third in recovery in those countries. And if it's a poor third, then girls are the most affected by those areas, as we've seen with COVID. How do we build that resilience and the urgency with which education systems have to be restored when governments come in to support natural disasters or civil disturbance?
30 seconds.
Yeah, I'll do that. And the quick thank you for the session as well. So I think really important, because we've seen over decades the fact that sort of natural disasters, conflict, etc., is where children suffer the most in terms of lack of education. And the humanitarian aid system just neglects education. When you speak to populations, and over again, there are surveys that ask those communities, what is it that they want? And they say they want their children to continue with education. They want some form of normalcy for their children in this very disrupted situation. And yet there are often no education facilities, or they're just very basic, or they're ones that the community themselves are setting up, but with very few resources. So this is why Education Cannot Wait was set up, because the humanitarian system was so neglecting education. And I think Education Cannot Wait, which is a fund specifically for this and to support the initiatives that do go on within those communities. So it's not just the financing, it's also the sort of approaches. But it's just far too little, and obviously too late for many children and young people. But we need to do far more to really push these humanitarian systems to recognise education as central to it, alongside sanitation, health, housing, etc., which are all obviously important as well. But it just strikes me time and time again, why is it that we neglect education in those settings when those communities are asking for it? So I think, Andrew, thank you so much for doing such a great job of pushing us on these questions and to everybody. And I'll let you sort of let everybody go for their coffee break. But I know we're going to have some very stimulating panels coming up that are going to pick up on some of these issues as well. This is my first time back in an event in person, so I'm feeling a bit emotional. I'm sorry if I can't hold a conversation as one would normally, but I'm hoping it will come naturally again sometime soon. Thank you
very much.
Alicia, Fiona, Pauline, Andrew, thank you very much for that. We do now have the coffee break. So if you are in this room, coffee is out that way. Bathrooms are that way and to the left. Fresh air is that way and to the right. If you are not in the room and you outnumber us quite significantly, I don't know where your fresh air, coffee and bathrooms are. See you here in about 25 minutes. Thank you very much.